My grandson had no idea that the sacred grip he'd just learned in the Mormon temple was the same one I'd been taught in a Masonic lodge 42 years ago. I stood there in the temple waiting room, watching Tyler walk toward me in his white clothes, his new bride Sarah on his arm, both of them glowing with that particular kind of joy that only the young and certain can possess. He was 23 years old, freshly sealed for time and all eternity, and his eyes held the brightness of a man who believed he had just participated in something ancient and divine. I was 67, a master mason for over 4 decades, and in that moment, I felt the ground beneath my feet shift in a way I had not experienced since the day I buried my wife. Tyler embraced me in the lobby of the Salt Lake Temple, that magnificent granite structure I had walked past thousands of times in my life without ever stepping inside. Non-members do not enter Mormon temples. I had known this my entire life, growing up in Salt Lake City, surrounded by Latter-day Saints in my neighborhood, my school, my workplace. I had attended their church services as a guest, eaten at their family dinners, watched their children grow alongside mine. But the temple had always remained closed to me, a beautiful mystery I had learned to respect from a distance. "Grandpa, it was incredible," Tyler whispered in my ear as he hugged me. "I wish you could have been in there with us." I wish I could have been there too, I thought, but not for the reasons he imagined. We gathered for photographs on the temple grounds, the June sun warm on our faces, the flower beds immaculate, the spires reaching toward a cloudless Utah sky. I smiled for the camera. I shook hands with Sarah's parents, good people from Provo who had welcomed my grandson into their family with genuine warmth. I made small talk with the bishop who had performed part of the ceremony. I did all the things a proud grandfather should do on his grandson's wedding day, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It had started 30 minutes earlier, when Tyler had emerged from the temple and pulled me aside before the photographs began. His face was flushed with excitement, and he spoke in that hushed, reverent tone that people use when they are sharing something sacred. "Grandpa, I can't tell you everything," he said. "We make promises not to reveal certain things, but I want you to know it was the most spiritual experience of my life. There were signs and tokens, special handshakes that have meaning. There was an apron we wore, white, with green leaves on it. And at the veil before we entered the celestial room, there was this moment where we had to give certain words and grips to pass through." He paused, searching my face for understanding. "It felt so ancient," he continued, "like we were connecting to something that goes all the way back to Solomon's temple. That's what they teach us, you know, that these ceremonies were revealed to Joseph Smith, restored from the original temple worship in Jerusalem." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral. But inside something had begun to crack. Signs and tokens, special handshakes, an apron with symbolic meaning, words and grips at the veil. I had performed those same rituals hundreds of times, not in a temple but in a lodge, not as a Latter-day Saint but as a Freemason. The grip Tyler described, the one given at the veil, matched precisely the token of the fellow craft degree, the second level of Masonic initiation. I had learned it when I was 25 years old, kneeling at an altar in a lodge room in downtown Salt Lake City, swearing an oath of secrecy while an older Mason guided my hand into the proper position. The apron he mentioned, with its green leaves, echoed the Masonic apron that every Mason receives upon initiation, a symbol of innocence, and the fig leaves worn by Adam and Eve. These were not vague similarities. These were precise correspondences. I had spent my entire adult life in the craft, as we Masons call our fraternity. I had risen through the degrees, served as worshipful master of my lodge, studied the history and symbolism of our rituals with the dedication of a scholar. Freemasonry had given me a framework for understanding morality, a brotherhood of good men striving to become better, a connection to traditions that stretched back centuries. It had sustained me through my wife's illness, through her death, through the long, lonely years that followed. And now my grandson was describing those same traditions, as if they had been revealed from heaven to a prophet in the 19th century. How was this possible? I did not say any of this to Tyler. Not then. His wedding day was not the time for difficult questions. So I smiled and told him I was proud of him, that I could see how much the ceremony meant to him, that I was happy he had found Sarah and built a life rooted in faith. All of these things were true, but they were not the complete truth. That night, driving home alone through the darkening streets of Salt Lake City, I could not stop thinking about what Tyler had described. The rational part of my mind, the part trained by decades of archival work, demanded evidence. Perhaps I had misunderstood. Perhaps the similarities were superficial, coincidental, the kind of parallels that emerge when any two traditions attempt to create sacred ritual. Perhaps I was seeing patterns that did not exist, but I knew better. I had spent 42 years learning the precise forms of Masonic ritual, memorizing the exact wording of obligations, practicing the specific positioning of hands and feet and body. What Tyler described was not similar to Freemasonry. It was Freemasonry, adapted and renamed, with new theological meaning layered on top of an existing structure. The question that haunted me was simple. Where did Joseph Smith learn these things? I knew almost nothing about the origins of Mormon temple ceremonies. Like most non-Mormons in Utah, I had absorbed a general awareness that temple worship was sacred to Latter-day Saints, that it involved ceremonies they did not discuss publicly, that it was connected somehow to their beliefs about eternal families and salvation. But I had never thought to investigate further. It had not been my business. I had respected their privacy, as I would want them to respect mine. Now, though, I needed to understand. Not to attack or expose, but simply to know. The connection I had glimpsed demanded explanation. Either I was wrong about what Tyler had described, or there was a historical relationship between Freemasonry and Mormon temple worship that no one had ever mentioned to me in 67 years of living in this city. If you've ever stumbled onto something that made you question everything you thought you knew, you understand this feeling. Subscribe to this channel, because some stories need to be told, and some questions deserve answers. I pulled into the driveway of my house, a modest brick home in the Avenues neighborhood where I had lived for 35 years. My wife Margaret and I had raised our daughter here, watched her grow and marry, and give us Tyler, our only grandchild. Margaret had been gone for 3 years now, taken by cancer at 62, and the house still felt too large and too quiet without her. I had considered selling it many times, but I could not bring myself to leave the garden she had planted, the kitchen where she had sung while cooking, the bedroom where I still slept on my side of the bed. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the dark windows of my empty house. Then I went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down at the desk in my study where I had spent so many hours over the years researching historical documents. I am by training and temperament an archival researcher. I spent 38 years working for the Utah State Archives, cataloging documents, preserving records, helping scholars and genealogists navigate the vast collections of papers and photographs and artifacts that tell the story of this state. I retired 5 years ago, but the habits of a lifetime do not disappear. When I encounter a question, I investigate. When I find a thread, I follow it. That night, I began to pull the thread. I started with what I knew for certain. Freemasonry arrived in America in the early 18th century, brought by colonists from England where the first Grand Lodge had been founded in 1717. By the time of the American Revolution, Masonic lodges existed throughout the colonies, and many of the founding fathers, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Paul Revere, were members of the craft. The fraternity grew rapidly in the new nation, establishing lodges in every state and territory, including the frontier regions where Joseph Smith grew up. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, the prophet who claimed to receive revelations from God, who translated the Book of Mormon from golden plates, who established a new religious movement that would eventually grow into a worldwide church of millions. What did I actually know about Joseph Smith's relationship to Freemasonry? Almost nothing, I realized. The subject had simply never come up in any conversation I could remember. Mormons did not discuss it. Masons did not discuss it. It existed in a strange blind spot, a question that no one seemed to ask. I opened my laptop and began to search. Within minutes, I found what I was looking for, and what I found made me sit back in my chair, my heart pounding. Joseph Smith was initiated as a Freemason on March 15, 1842, in Nauvoo, Illinois. The date was not in dispute. It was recorded in the official minutes of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge. Smith received the first degree of Masonry, the entered apprentice, on March 15th, and the following day, March 16th. He was advanced to the second and third degrees, Fellow Craft and Master Mason. This rapid advancement was unusual. Typically, a candidate would wait weeks or months between degrees. But exceptions were sometimes made for prominent men, and Joseph Smith was certainly prominent. He was the prophet of a growing religious movement, the mayor of Nauvoo, the commander of a private militia called the Nauvoo Legion. The Masons of Illinois were eager to welcome him into their ranks. I stared at the date on my screen, March 15, 1842. Then I searched for the date when Joseph Smith first introduced the temple endowment ceremony to his followers. May 4, 1842. 7 weeks. Joseph Smith became a master mason, learned all the rituals and symbols of the craft, and 7 weeks later introduced a sacred ceremony that contained those same rituals and symbols, now framed as ancient ordinances restored by divine revelation. I sat in the darkness of my study, the blue glow of the laptop screen the only light, and I felt something shifting inside me. This was not a coincidence. This was not a vague similarity that could be explained away. This was a direct, documented, chronological connection between two systems of ritual that I had always believed were completely separate, and no one had ever told me. I thought of Tyler asleep now beside his new wife, believing that the ceremony he had participated in that morning was a restoration of something practiced by Adam and Eve, by Abraham, by Solomon. I thought of the millions of Latter-day Saints who entered their temples each year, donning aprons and learning tokens and speaking sacred words, never knowing that a man in Illinois had learned those same forms in a Masonic lodge just weeks before introducing them as divine revelation. I thought of my own Masonic brothers, men I had known for decades who must have noticed these similarities if they ever attended a Mormon temple ceremony or spoke with someone who had. Why had no one talked about this? I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. The house was silent around me, Margaret's absence a physical weight in the air. I wished I could talk to her about what I had found. She had always been the wise one, the one who knew how to navigate difficult truths with grace. She would have known what to do with this information, how to think about it, whether and how to share it. But Margaret was gone, and I was alone with a discovery that felt like it could change everything. I walked into that room not knowing it would be the last time I'd see my faith, my family, and my fraternity as the separate things I had always believed them to be. The weeks that followed my grandson's wedding became a kind of obsession. I could not let go of what I had discovered, could not silence the questions that multiplied every time I thought I had found an answer. I am not a man prone to obsession. Margaret used to tease me about my methodical nature, my insistence on completing one task before beginning another, my careful filing systems and labeled folders. But this was different. This felt like standing at the edge of a vast underground chamber, shining a small flashlight into the darkness, watching the beam reveal passages and rooms that extended far beyond what I had imagined. I began spending my mornings at the Utah State Historical Society Library, the same building where I had worked for nearly 4 decades. The staff knew me, welcomed me back, assumed I was researching some genealogical project or local history question. I did not correct them. I was not ready to explain what I was actually looking for. The historical record I discovered was far more extensive than I had expected. The connection between Joseph Smith and Freemasonry was not a secret. It was not hidden or suppressed. It was simply not discussed, existing in that peculiar category of facts that everyone who studies the subject knows, but no one mentions in polite company. I found the minutes of the Nauvoo Lodge, recording Joseph Smith's initiation in March 1842. I found letters written by early Mormon leaders who were also Masons, men like Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young, discussing the ceremonies in terms that made clear they recognized the parallels. I found accounts from non-Mormon Masons in Illinois who had raised concerns about what was happening in Nauvoo, who had noticed that the Latter-day Saints were adapting Masonic rituals for their own religious purposes. The Grand Lodge of Illinois had actually revoked the charter of the Nauvoo Lodge in 1844, just 2 years after it was established. The official reasons cited were procedural irregularities, rapid growth that violated Masonic protocols, initiation of too many candidates too quickly. But the underlying tension was clear in the correspondence I found. The Masons of Illinois were uncomfortable with what the Mormons were doing with their rituals. I sat in the quiet reading room of the Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of documents and microfilm readers, and I began to compile a list of the specific correspondences between Masonic ritual and the Mormon temple endowment. The list grew longer than I had anticipated. The apron. In Freemasonry, every initiate receives a white lambskin apron, symbol of innocence, which he wears during lodge meetings and is eventually buried with. In the Mormon temple, participants wear an apron of green fig leaves over their white clothing, representing the apron Adam and Eve made after partaking of the forbidden fruit. The tokens. In Freemasonry, each degree has specific handshakes, called grips or tokens, by which Masons can recognize one another. The fellow craft grip involves pressing the thumb against the space between the first and second knuckles of the other person's hand. The Master Mason grip involves a more complex interlocking of fingers. In the Mormon temple, participants learn grips that match these forms precisely, given at the veil before entering the celestial room. The signs. Masonic ritual includes hand signs associated with each degree, gestures involving the positioning of hands and arms that carry symbolic meaning. The Mormon temple ceremony includes similar signs, some of which were modified or removed in 1990 but were essentially identical to Masonic forms for nearly 150 years. The penalties. Until 1990, the Mormon temple ceremony included symbolic penalties associated with the violation of sacred covenants, gestures mimicking the throat being cut, the chest being opened, the body being disemboweled. These matched precisely the penalty signs of the 3 degrees of Blue Lodge Masonry, gestures I had learned myself and performed hundreds of times in lodge, the 5 points of fellowship. In Masonic ritual, this refers to a specific embrace between 2 Masons, involving foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, hand to back, and cheek to cheek or mouth to ear. The same embrace, with the same name, existed in the Mormon temple ceremony until 1990. The more I researched, the more correspondences I found. The architectural layout of the temple ceremony, moving through progressive stages toward a final revelation. The clothing, the altar, the symbolic journey from darkness to light. Even specific phrases and wordings that appeared in both traditions. I was not the first person to notice these things. Scholars had written about the connections for decades. There were academic papers, books, doctoral dissertations examining the relationship between Freemasonry and Mormon temple worship. The information was available to anyone who looked for it. But somehow, it had never reached me, never penetrated the comfortable separation I had maintained between my life as a Mason and my life as a neighbor to Latter-day Saints. One afternoon, I found a letter that stopped me cold. It was written by Heber C. Kimball, one of Joseph Smith's closest associates and himself a Mason, dated June 1842, just weeks after the first endowment ceremonies were performed. Kimball was writing to a fellow Mormon who had not yet received the endowment, and his words carried a remarkable frankness. He wrote that there was a similarity between the priesthood ordinances in the temple and the rituals of Freemasonry, and that he believed both derived from an original source in the Temple of Solomon, though the Masonic version had become corrupted over time, while the Mormon version represented a restoration of the pure original form. I read the letter 3 times, making sure I understood what Kimball was saying. He was not denying the connection. He was acknowledging it openly, explaining it theologically. In his view, Freemasonry preserved fragments of ancient truth, broken pieces of a puzzle that Joseph Smith had been divinely guided to reassemble in their proper form. This was not the explanation I had expected. I had assumed when I began my research that I would find either a deliberate cover-up or a series of coincidences that could be explained away. Instead, I found early Mormon leaders openly acknowledging the Masonic origins of their temple ceremonies, simply framing those origins differently than a non-Mormon observer would. Have you ever discovered something about your family, your church, or your past that you weren't sure you should share? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. The question of how to interpret these facts began to trouble me more than the facts themselves. I was a Mason, committed to my fraternity and its teachings. I was not a believer in Joseph Smith's prophetic claims. From my perspective, the simplest explanation was that Smith had learned Masonic rituals in March 1842 and adapted them for his own religious purposes 7 weeks later. This was not divine restoration. This was human creativity, perhaps even appropriation. But I could also see how a believing Latter-day Saint might view the same evidence differently. If you believed that Joseph Smith was a genuine prophet, receiving revelation from God, then perhaps the similarities between Masonic and Mormon ritual were not evidence of copying but of common origin. Perhaps God had preserved fragments of ancient temple worship within Freemasonry, waiting for the moment when a prophet could restore them to their fullness. Perhaps Joseph Smith recognized these fragments because he had been prepared by revelation to see them. I did not believe this explanation, but I could understand why someone who had already accepted Smith's prophetic authority would find it compelling. The evidence itself was neutral. It was the framework of interpretation that determined what the evidence meant. This realization troubled me deeply. I had spent my career working with historical documents, helping researchers understand the past through primary sources. I believed in the power of evidence to reveal truth. But here I was confronting a situation where the same evidence could support radically different conclusions, depending on what you already believed. I thought of Tyler, my grandson, newly married and deeply committed to his faith. If I showed him what I had found, what would he see? Would he see evidence that his temple ceremonies were borrowed from Freemasonry? Or would he see evidence that Freemasonry preserved fragments of the ancient truth his prophet had restored? The answer, I realized, depended entirely on which question he was asking, and I was not sure I had the right to decide which question he should ask. As spring turned to summer, I continued my research, but my focus shifted. I began looking not just for evidence of the connection, but for how that connection had been discussed and understood over the past 180 years. I found that the topic was not as suppressed as I had initially believed. Mormon scholars had written about it openly, though usually for academic audiences rather than general church membership. The church's official stance seemed to be one of quiet acknowledgement without emphasis. They did not deny that Joseph Smith was a Mason, or that Masonic elements existed in the temple ceremony. They simply did not draw attention to these facts, preferring to frame the temple experience in terms of eternal covenants and sacred ordinances rather than historical influences. I found anti-Mormon literature that used the Masonic connection as a weapon, claiming it proved Joseph Smith was a fraud who stole his ceremonies from the lodge. This approach troubled me. The fact that Smith incorporated Masonic elements into his temple worship did not automatically prove fraud. Many religious traditions borrow and adapt from earlier sources. Christianity itself emerged from Judaism, incorporating and transforming Jewish concepts and practices. The question was not whether borrowing occurred, but what meaning that borrowing carried. I also found thoughtful analyses by scholars who were themselves Latter-day Saints, wrestling honestly with the evidence and offering nuanced interpretations. Some argued that God had deliberately planted seeds of temple truth within Freemasonry, preparing the way for restoration. Others suggested that Joseph Smith, having recognized certain truths through revelation, found in Masonic ritual a useful symbolic language for expressing those truths. Still others simply acknowledge the connection as a historical fact without feeling the need to explain it theologically. What struck me most was the silence at the popular level. The average Mormon in the pew, the typical family attending temple sessions, probably had no idea that this connection existed. The information was available, but it was not taught, not emphasized, not part of the standard narrative of faith. Tyler had never heard of it. His wife Sarah had never heard of it. Their parents, lifelong members of the church, seemed unaware of it. Was this silence a problem? I found myself uncertain. Every institution, religious or secular, has aspects of its history that it does not emphasize. Every tradition carries complexity that is not communicated to newcomers. Was the silence about Masonic connections different in kind from the silence about other difficult historical topics? I thought about my own fraternity. Freemasonry had its share of historical complexity, of controversial moments and difficult figures. We did not lead with these topics when welcoming new members. We focused on the positive, on the brotherhood, on the charitable work, on the moral teachings. Was this so different from what the Mormon Church did with its temple ceremonies? But there was a difference, I decided. The difference lay in the specific claims being made. The Mormon Church taught that its temple ceremonies were restored by revelation, preserved from the time of Adam and Solomon, sacred ordinances with ancient origin. This claim was not simply incomplete, it was misleading, given the documented historical evidence that the ceremonies emerged 7 weeks after Joseph Smith's Masonic initiation. A tradition can be beautiful and meaningful, even if its origins are recent. A ritual can be powerful and transformative even if it was adapted from another source. But claiming ancient restoration when the evidence points to 19th century adaptation was something else. It was asking people to believe something that the historical record contradicted. I closed my notebook and looked around the empty reading room. The summer light was fading, casting long shadows across the tables where I had spent so many hours. I was no closer to knowing what to do with what I had learned. The evidence was clear. The interpretation was complicated. And the human dimension, my relationship with Tyler, remained the most difficult question of all. I gathered my papers and returned the document boxes to the archives. Walking out into the warm evening air, I passed Temple Square, its grounds immaculate, its spires catching the last light of the setting sun. Somewhere inside that building or in one of the other temples scattered across the world, people were participating in ceremonies that connected, whether they knew it or not, to the same rituals I had practiced in my lodge for 4 decades. We were linked, Masons and Mormons, in ways that neither community openly acknowledged. The signs I made in lodge, they made in the temple. The tokens I learned as a young man, they learned at the veil. The apron I wore, they wore. And Joseph Smith had stood at the center of both worlds, a master Mason who became a prophet, a man who took the forms of one tradition and filled them with the content of another. I drove home through the darkening streets, past the houses of my neighbors, some Mormon, some not, all of them living their lives unaware of the historical threads that connected their communities. I thought about Heber C. Kimball's letter, his confident assertion that both Masonry and Mormonism derived from Solomon's temple, that the resemblance was not theft, but recognition. Maybe he was right, in a way he had not intended. Maybe all sacred traditions are attempts to express something beyond words, something that exists before and beneath the forms we use to approach it. Maybe the rituals I loved in both the lodge and what I had learned of the temple pointed toward a truth that transcended their historical origins. But I was not sure that this philosophical comfort would help Tyler if he learned what I had learned. He was young, certain, newly married, building his life on foundations he believed were eternal and divine. What would it do to him to discover that those foundations had been laid in a Masonic lodge in Illinois, just 7 weeks before his prophet claimed to restore them from the mists of antiquity? I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, just as I had on the night of his wedding. The house was dark. Margaret was not there to greet me, to listen to my discoveries, to help me know what to do. I was alone with the truth, and the truth felt heavier than I had expected. What I did not know, sitting there in the darkness, was that Tyler had already begun to notice my silence. My grandson was more perceptive than I had given him credit for. He could sense that something had changed between us, that I was holding something back, and he was not the kind of young man who let mysteries remain unsolved. The confrontation I had been dreading was coming. I just did not know how soon. The call came on a Sunday evening in late August, 3 months after the wedding. I was sitting in my study, reading a book about the history of religious symbolism, when my phone buzzed with Tyler's name on the screen. We had spoken several times since the wedding, but our conversations had been careful, surface level, circling around the deeper waters that neither of us seemed ready to enter. I would ask about his new job at the accounting firm. He would ask about my garden. We would exchange pleasantries about the weather, about Sarah's parents, about the upcoming football season. We did not talk about the temple. "Grandpa," he said when I answered, "Sarah's visiting her sister in Provo this weekend. I was thinking maybe I could come over for dinner tomorrow night, just the two of us." Something in his voice told me this was not a casual invitation. There was a weight to his words, a deliberateness that reminded me of myself when I was preparing to ask a difficult question. "Of course," I said. "I'll make your grandmother's pot roast." "That sounds perfect." He paused. "Grandpa, there's something I want to talk to you about. Something I've been thinking about since the wedding." My heart began to beat faster. "All right," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We can talk about whatever you need." After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the gathering darkness of my study. The moment I had been both dreading and anticipating had arrived. Tyler wanted to talk. He had been thinking about something since the wedding. It did not take much imagination to guess what that something might be. I spent the next day preparing. Not just the pot roast, though I followed Margaret's recipe with careful attention, browning the meat just the way she had taught me, adding the vegetables at the right moment, letting the whole thing simmer until the house filled with the smell of her cooking. I also prepared myself mentally, thinking through what I might say, how I might present what I had learned, what questions Tyler might ask, and how I might answer them. I decided that I would not volunteer information. I would let Tyler lead the conversation, let him ask what he wanted to ask. If he did not bring up the temple ceremonies, I would not mention them. But if he did, I would be honest. I would not lie to my grandson. I would not pretend I had not noticed what I had noticed. Tyler arrived at 6 o'clock, still wearing his white shirt and tie from church. He looked older than he had at the wedding, though only 3 months had passed. Marriage changes people, I have observed. It adds a layer of seriousness, a weight of responsibility that shows in the eyes and the set of the shoulders. Tyler had always been a thoughtful young man, but now there was something more, a depth that had not been there before. We ate dinner at the kitchen table where I had shared thousands of meals with Margaret, where we had raised our daughter, where Tyler had eaten his grandmother's cooking since he was old enough to sit in a high chair. The pot roast was good. Tyler complimented it, said it tasted just like he remembered. We talked about his work, about Sarah's new position as an elementary school teacher, about the house they were hoping to buy in the spring. But underneath the pleasant conversation, I could feel the tension building. Tyler kept glancing at me, then looking away. He would start to say something, then stop. He pushed his food around his plate more than he ate it. Finally, as I was clearing the dishes, he spoke. "Grandpa, can I ask you something about Freemasonry?" I set the plates in the sink and turned to face him. "Of course." "How long have you been a Mason?" 42 years this past March." He nodded slowly. "And in all that time, you never thought to mention anything to me about the temple ceremonies?" There it was, the question I had been waiting for. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, giving the moment the weight it deserved. "I didn't know what the temple ceremonies involved until your wedding day," I said carefully. I'm not a member of the church. I've never been inside a temple. Everything I know about the endowment ceremony, I learned from research after you described parts of it to me. Tyler's eyes narrowed slightly. But you recognized something. I could see it in your face that day. When I was telling you about the experience, something changed in your expression. You tried to hide it, but I saw it. He was right. He had seen it. My careful mask had not been as effective as I had hoped. Yes, I admitted. I recognized something. What did you recognize? I took a deep breath. This was the moment. There would be no going back from whatever I said next. Tyler, when you described the grips you learned at the Veil, the tokens as you called them, I recognized them as Masonic handshakes, the same ones I learned when I was initiated into the lodge 42 years ago. When you described the apron, I recognized elements of the Masonic apron. When you described signs made with your hands, I recognized Masonic signs. Tyler sat very still. His face had gone pale. You're saying the temple ceremonies are copied from Freemasonry? I'm saying there are significant similarities, precise correspondences, more than can be explained by coincidence. But the temple ceremonies are ancient, Tyler said. They were revealed to Joseph Smith. They go back to the time of Adam to Solomon's temple. That's what we're taught, that's what I believe. I nodded. I know that's what you've been taught, but there's historical evidence that complicates that narrative. What evidence? I had promised myself I would be honest. So I was. Joseph Smith was initiated as a Freemason on March 15, 1842, in Nauvoo, Illinois. He received all 3 degrees of Blue Lodge Masonry within 2 days. 7 weeks later, on May 4, 1842, he introduced the temple endowment ceremony for the first time. The ceremonies contain numerous elements that are identical or nearly identical to Masonic rituals, elements that did not exist in Mormon worship before Smith became a Mason. Tyler stared at me. I could see him processing what I had said, trying to fit it into the framework of his faith. That doesn't prove anything, he said finally. Maybe God revealed the same truths to both traditions. Maybe Freemasonry preserved fragments of ancient temple worship, and Joseph Smith restored the fullness. That's one interpretation, I agreed. Some early Mormon leaders, including Heber C. Kimball, who was both a Mason and an apostle, made exactly that argument. They acknowledged the similarities openly and explained them theologically. So the church doesn't deny this? The church doesn't emphasize it. But no, it's not hidden. Scholars have written about it. The historical record is available to anyone who looks for it. Tyler stood up abruptly and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to me, looking out at the darkness of the backyard. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity of his spine. Why didn't anyone tell me? He asked quietly. I went through years of seminary, years of Sunday school, 4 years at BYU. I prepared for my mission, served 2 years teaching people about the gospel, and not once did anyone mention that Joseph Smith was a Freemason or that the temple ceremonies resembled Masonic rituals. I don't know why they didn't tell you, I said. I can't speak for the church or its educational decisions. He turned to face me. But you could have told me, before the wedding, before I went through the temple for the first time. You could have said something. The accusation in his voice cut deeper than I had expected. I didn't know before the wedding, I reminded him. I recognized the similarities when you described the ceremony to me. By then you had already been through the endowment. You were already sealed to Sarah. But after, these past 3 months, you've been researching this, haven't you? I can tell. You've been acting strange, distant. You've been sitting on this information, deciding whether to tell me. Were you ever going to say anything, or were you just going to let me live in ignorance? I had no good answer to that question. The truth was, I had not decided. I had been caught between my desire to protect him and my commitment to honesty, between my respect for his faith and my dedication to evidence. I didn't want to hurt you, I said. I didn't want to damage your faith or your marriage or your happiness. You seemed so certain, so fulfilled. I wasn't sure I had the right to disturb that. Tyler laughed, but there was no humor in it. So you were going to protect me from the truth? Like I'm a child who can't handle difficult information? No. I was trying to figure out the right time and the right way. There is no manual for this, Tyler. No guidebook for how to tell your grandson that the sacred ceremonies he just participated in have historical origins he was never taught about. He sat down again, heavily, as if the strength had gone out of his legs. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I need to see the evidence, he said finally. I need to see it for myself. I nodded. I have documents in my study, letters, historical records, scholarly analyses. I'll show you everything I've found. We spent the next 3 hours at my desk, going through the materials I had accumulated over the summer. I showed him the minutes of the Nauvoo Lodge, recording Joseph Smith's initiation. I showed him Heber C. Kimball's letter, acknowledging the similarities between Masonic and Mormon ritual. I showed him the timeline, the 7 weeks between initiation and endowment. I showed him the scholarly comparisons of specific elements, the tokens and signs and penalties that matched between the two traditions. Tyler read everything carefully, asking questions, taking notes. He was approaching this the way I had, as a researcher seeking to understand rather than a believer seeking to defend. I was proud of him for that, even as I ached for the pain I could see in his eyes. Near midnight, he set down the last document and sat back in his chair. It's all true, he said. Everything you told me. The connection is documented. The timeline is clear. Joseph Smith learned Masonic rituals and then incorporated them into the temple ceremony. Yes. And the church knows this. Mormon scholars have written about it. It's not a secret. It's not a secret, but it's also not taught, not emphasized. Most members go their whole lives without encountering this information. Tyler rubbed his eyes. He looked exhausted, but beneath the exhaustion I could see something else. Not anger exactly. Not doubt exactly. Something more complicated, more layered. Why? He asked. Why wouldn't they tell us? If there's a good explanation, if the Heber C. Kimball interpretation is correct, why not just teach it openly? Why let people discover it on their own and feel like they've been deceived? I don't know, I said honestly. I can only speculate. Perhaps they worry that the information would be disturbing to members who aren't prepared for it. Perhaps they found that most people don't ask these questions, so there's no reason to raise them. Perhaps they believe the spiritual experience of the temple is more important than its historical origins. But doesn't truth matter? Tyler's voice cracked slightly. Doesn't honesty matter? I've spent my whole life being taught that the church is true, that it has the fullness of the gospel, that its leaders are inspired by God. And now I find out that they've been, not lying exactly, but not telling the whole truth either. I reached across the desk and put my hand on his arm. Tyler, I want to be very careful here. I am not a member of your church. I don't believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, but I recognize that my perspective is not the only valid one. There are faithful Latter-day Saints who know everything you now know and who still believe. The evidence doesn't dictate a single conclusion. It depends on what questions you're asking and what framework you're using to interpret the answers. What do you mean? I mean that you could look at this evidence and conclude that Joseph Smith borrowed from Freemasonry, that the temple ceremonies are human creations rather than divine restorations. That's my interpretation. But you could also look at the same evidence and conclude that God preserved elements of ancient truth within Freemasonry, fragments that Joseph Smith recognized and restored to their proper form. That's the faithful interpretation, and it's not irrational. It's just based on different assumptions about Joseph Smith's prophetic authority. Tyler stared at me. You're defending the church? I'm defending intellectual honesty. The evidence doesn't prove fraud. It proves connection. What that connection means depends on what you already believe about larger questions of revelation and authority. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I had been dreading most. What do you think I should do, Grandpa? I had thought about this question for months, turning it over in my mind, examining it from every angle. Now that he had asked it, I found I had no easy answer. "I think you should take your time," I said slowly. "Don't make any sudden decisions. Don't leave your faith or your marriage or your community in a moment of crisis. Talk to people you trust, people who know more than I do about how to navigate this kind of information within a faithful framework. Read the faithful responses as well as the critical ones, and ultimately, decide for yourself what you believe and what kind of life you want to live." That's not very specific. No, it's not, because this is your journey, Tyler, not mine. I can share what I've learned, but I can't tell you what it should mean to you. That's something only you can determine. He nodded slowly. Then he stood up, gathered his notes, and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Thank you for being honest with me," he said, "even though it was hard, even though you weren't sure you should." "Thank you for asking," I replied. "It takes courage to pursue truth even when it might be uncomfortable." He hugged me then, a long embrace that reminded me of all the hugs we had shared over the years, from the time he was a small boy running to greet me to the man he had become. When he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, Tyler." He left a few minutes later, driving off into the night with a stack of photocopies on his passenger seat and a weight on his shoulders that had not been there when he arrived. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner, and I felt something shift in my chest. I had told the truth. I had answered his questions honestly. I had given him the respect of treating him as an adult capable of handling difficult information. But I did not know if I had done the right thing. What I did know was that the truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. Tyler would never see his temple ceremonies the same way again. Whether that was liberation or loss, I could not say. Only time would tell what kind of man would emerge from this crucible of doubt and discovery. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. Tyler and I did not speak, not because of anger or estrangement, but because he had asked for space, time to process what he had learned, time to find his own footing on ground that had shifted beneath him. I respected his request, though every day I fought the urge to call him, to ask how he was doing, to make sure I had not broken something precious between us. I kept myself busy with the routines of my solitary life. I tended Margaret's garden, pulling weeds and watering the roses she had planted the year before she got sick. I attended my lodge meetings, sitting in the same chair I had occupied for decades, performing the same rituals I had performed hundreds of times, but now seeing them through different eyes. Every token, every sign, every word of the obligation carried a new weight, a new awareness of how these forms had traveled beyond the walls of our lodge into spaces I had never imagined. I thought often about cause and effect, about how actions ripple outward through time in ways we cannot predict or control. Joseph Smith had knelt at a Masonic altar in 1842, received the degrees of the craft, learned the secret handshakes and signs that Masons had guarded for generations. 7 weeks later, he had introduced those same forms to his followers, wrapped in new meaning, pointed toward new purposes. And now, nearly 2 centuries later, those actions were still creating consequences, still shaping lives, still forcing people like Tyler to grapple with questions that Smith himself might never have anticipated. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Nothing happens by chance. I had learned this principle in the lodge, framed in the language of Masonic philosophy. I had seen it confirmed again and again in my work as an archivist, tracing the threads of history, watching how decisions made in one century created ripples in the next. And now I was living it, experiencing firsthand how the choices of a man who died in 1844 could reach across time and touch my grandson's faith in 2024. I wondered sometimes if Smith had understood what he was doing. Had he known that the rituals he adapted would become sacred to millions? Had he anticipated that someday, in a future he could not imagine, a young man in Salt Lake City would sit at his grandfather's desk and confront the evidence of that adaptation? Or had he simply acted in the moment, using the tools available to him, trusting that God or history or both would sort out the consequences. I would never know. Smith had been dead for 180 years. His motivations, his intentions, his understanding of his own actions were beyond my reach. All I had were the documents he left behind, the timeline of his life, the ceremonies that bore his imprint. The meaning of those facts remained open, contested, dependent on frameworks of interpretation that varied from person to person. This uncertainty troubled me less than I had expected. I had spent my career working with incomplete evidence, helping researchers piece together narratives from fragmentary sources. I knew that history rarely offered clean answers, that the past was always more complicated than our stories about it. The connection between Freemasonry and Mormon temple worship was real, documented, undeniable. What that connection meant was a different question, one that each person had to answer for themselves. October arrived with its golden light and cooling temperatures, the mountains around Salt Lake City catching fire with autumn color. I was raking leaves in my front yard one Saturday afternoon when a car pulled into my driveway. Tyler's car. I set down the rake and waited as he got out and walked toward me. He looked different than he had the night of our conversation. The tension was gone from his shoulders. His eyes were clear, calm, settled in a way they had not been before. "Hey, Grandpa," he said. "Hey yourself." We stood there for a moment, neither of us sure how to begin. Then Tyler smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and I felt something loosen in my chest. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Of course. Come inside. I'll make some coffee." I caught myself. "Or hot chocolate, if you prefer." Tyler laughed. "Hot chocolate is fine. Some habits are hard to break." We sat in the kitchen, the same table where we had eaten pot roast, the same chairs where we had begun this journey 3 months earlier. The autumn light slanted through the windows, catching the steam rising from our mugs. I waited for Tyler to speak, giving him the space to say what he had come to say. "I've done a lot of thinking," he began. "A lot of reading, a lot of praying. I talked to Sarah about everything. I talked to my bishop. I even talked to a religion professor at BYU who specializes in church history. And I'm not leaving the church." I nodded slowly, careful not to show either approval or disappointment. This was his decision, not mine. "I thought about it," he continued. "There were days when I seriously considered walking away. The evidence is real. The connection is documented. Everything you showed me checked out. I verified it myself through independent sources. Joseph Smith was a Mason. The temple ceremonies contain Masonic elements. The timeline is exactly what you said it was. So why stay?" Tyler wrapped his hands around his mug, staring into the chocolate as if the answer might be written there. "Because the evidence doesn't tell me what to do with the evidence. It just tells me what happened. And what I do with that information depends on what I already believe about other things, bigger things, things the historical record can't prove or disprove. Such as whether God exists, whether revelation is real, whether Joseph Smith, whatever his flaws and whatever his methods, was genuinely called to restore something true. Those aren't historical questions. They're faith questions. And I've realized that my faith doesn't depend on having perfect answers to every historical question." I felt a complex mix of emotions, admiration for his thoughtfulness, concern about what might be intellectual rationalization, respect for his autonomy, lingering worry about the foundations he was building his life upon. But I kept my face neutral, my voice even. "That sounds like a mature approach," I said. "I learned it from you, actually." "From me?" Tyler smiled. "You told me that night that the evidence doesn't dictate a single conclusion. That what the Masonic connection means depends on what framework I use to interpret it. You said faithful Latter-day Saints can know everything I know and still believe. You gave me permission to find my own way. I didn't want to tell you what to think. I know, and that's exactly what I needed. Not someone telling me the church is true and I should ignore the evidence. Not someone telling me the church is false and I should leave. Just someone who respected me enough to share the truth and let me figure out what to do with it. He reached across the table and put his hand on mine. Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you for being honest with me. Thank you for trusting me to handle difficult information. Thank you for not trying to protect me from the truth. I felt tears prick at my eyes and blinked them back. You're welcome, I managed. I want to tell you something else, Tyler said. Something I've realized through all of this. What's that? The temple ceremonies still mean something to me. Even knowing where some of the forms came from, even understanding the historical connection to Freemasonry, the experience is still sacred. When I make those signs and tokens, I'm not thinking about Masonic lodges in Illinois. I'm thinking about my covenants with God, my promises to Sarah, my connection to something eternal. The meaning isn't in the history. The meaning is in what I bring to it. I thought about my own experience in the lodge, the rituals I had performed so many times. Did the historical origins of Freemasonry diminish their power for me? Did knowing that the craft had evolved over centuries, absorbing influences from various sources, make the brotherhood less real or the moral teachings less true? No. The meaning was not in the history. The meaning was in what I brought to it. Perhaps Tyler and I were not so different after all. There's something I want to ask you, Tyler said. Something I've been thinking about for a while. Ask. Would you ever consider coming to a family home evening with me and Sarah? Not to convert you or anything, just to share something that matters to me, the way you've shared your lodge with me over the years. I was surprised by the invitation, touched by the gesture. Tyler was not trying to pull away from me or from the difficult conversation we had shared. He was trying to bridge the gap, to find common ground between his world and mine. I would like that, I said. Really? Really. I may not share your faith, but I can respect it. And I would be honored to see what your spiritual life looks like from the inside. Tyler's face lit up with a smile that reminded me of the little boy he had once been, running through my backyard, climbing the apple tree Margaret had planted, shouting for me to watch him swing from the highest branch. Thank you, Grandpa. That means more than you know. We sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the easy connection that had always existed between us. The weight that had pressed on my chest for months finally lifted. I had told the truth. Tyler had faced it with courage and thoughtfulness. Our relationship had not broken. It had deepened. I want to know, what moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it the discovery, the confrontation, or the resolution? Tell me in the comments below. Your story matters too. That night, after Tyler left, I drove to my lodge. It was not a meeting night, but I had a key, and sometimes I went there just to sit in the empty lodge room, surrounded by the symbols and furniture that had shaped so much of my life. I sat in the east in the worshipful master's chair, looking out at the empty chairs where my brothers usually sat. The room was dark except for the dim light filtering through the windows, the altar a shadow in the center of the floor, the letter G hanging above it barely visible in the gloom. I thought about Joseph Smith, sitting in a room much like this one in Nauvoo, Illinois, receiving the same degrees I had received, learning the same tokens and signs, hearing the same lectures about morality and brotherhood. What had he felt in that moment? What had he seen in our rituals that made him want to adapt them for his own purposes? I would never know. But I found that my anger toward him, if I had ever truly felt anger, had faded. He was a man of his time, using the tools available to him, building something that millions of people had found meaningful. Whether he was a prophet or a fraud, a genuine seeker, or a cunning manipulator, the movement he created had shaped countless lives, including Tyler's, and Freemasonry had shaped mine. Perhaps that was the deepest truth I had discovered through all of this. Not the historical connection between two traditions, but the way that meaning is created and transmitted, the way that symbols and rituals carry power regardless of their origins. the way that human beings reach toward something transcendent through whatever forms are available to them. The rituals I had performed for 42 years were not diminished by knowing their history. They were not made false by understanding how they had evolved, how they had been borrowed and adapted and transformed over centuries. They were true in the way that mattered most, true because of what they represented, true because of the brotherhood they created, true because of the moral commitments they encoded. Tyler's temple ceremonies were the same. They were true for him not because of their historical origins, but because of what he brought to them, the faith and devotion and love that he invested in those sacred moments. The forms were borrowed from Freemasonry. The meaning was his own. I drove home through the quiet streets of Salt Lake City, past the temple that gleamed white in the darkness, past the homes of my neighbors, past the garden where Margaret's roses still bloomed. The night was cold, the stars brilliant overhead, the world both ancient and new. I thought about Tyler and Sarah, building their life together, raising the family they would someday have, passing on traditions that would outlive them all. I thought about my own life, the years stretching behind me, the uncertain time remaining ahead. I thought about Margaret, gone now, but still present in every corner of my house, every memory I carried, every rose that bloomed in her garden. What remains after the questions, I realized, is stronger than what existed before. The faith that survives scrutiny is more genuine than the faith that fears it. The love that endures difficult truths is deeper than the love that depends on comfortable illusions. Tyler and I had walked through fire together. We had faced hard questions and uncertain answers. We had risked our relationship for the sake of honesty. And we had emerged on the other side, not unchanged, but not broken. Different, deeper, more real. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment looking at the dark windows of my house. It was still too large, still too quiet, still marked by Margaret's absence. But it was home. And tomorrow, Tyler and Sarah would come for dinner, and we would talk and laugh and share the ordinary moments that make up a life. The past could not be changed. Joseph Smith had learned our rituals and adapted them for his purposes. That fact would stand forever, carved into the historical record. But the future remained unwritten. What Tyler did with his faith, what I did with my remaining years, what our family became in the decades ahead, all of that was still being created, still being shaped by the choices we made each day. I got out of the car and walked to my front door. The key turned in the lock, the same lock Margaret and I had installed 30 years ago. The door swung open onto darkness. I stepped inside, turned on the light, and began to prepare for tomorrow.